Wow, pura vida. Much love and respect. Thanks for tuning in once again. Again, I'm an Access Genealogy, a free genealogy website. So now we're going to be talking about Dominique De Gourgues' expedition, 1568. De Gourgues' two-ship fleet temporarily anchored off the south coast of Cuba in early November 1568. De Gourgues is totally silent about where he was and what he did until he rendezvoused in mid-April at a pre-designated anchorage on the Medway River in Georgia. The location of the village of Takaturu. The location was near present-day Midway, Georgia, 24 miles south of present-day Savannah. All of the forts built by Pardo were destroyed during this period of De Gourgues' silence. The systematic destruction of Spanish power north of San Agustin suggests that some Europeans were operating as advisors to native provinces in the interior. De Gourgues' report to the king leaves many unanswered questions. All right, so what does Wikipedia say about Dominique De Gourgues? It says he was born around 1530. 1583 was a French nobleman and soldier. He is best known for leading an attack against Spanish Florida in 1568. So, just want to point out that most likely he is a Huguenot. We're going to see that. And also that he was attacking not specifically Spanish, because a lot of them are Spanish or French, but the Catholics, who was at constant war with them. And he did that in response to the destruction of French Fort Caroline. Right? That's the one we read about already, which was founded by René Goulain de Lanaudière. Remember, Lanaudière was a Huguenot. So he was mad at what happened there. We're going to read what happened. All right? And how he got revenge. I want to read down here real quick. It says, situation in the colonies. Philip II of Spain. I touched the hijack with this whitewash image. What are you talking about, Kurimeo? It says he was a Roman Catholic. So he was with the Catholics, right? This is Charles V's son. Charles V is a so-called black man. So the one they're showing us here is definitely not him. So he was a Roman Catholic king who hated Protestants. Who's the Protestants? He hated who? The cryptos, the crypto Muslims, crypto Jews, the new Christians, the converts. He hated them. Remember, they were persecuting the Catholics. The Inquisition was all about getting rid of them. And even if they hid under Protestantism or these other names, they knew who they were. That's why they hated Protestants, including the French Huguenots. Again, who's the Huguenots? Moors, right? The Catholics are after the Moors and the Jews of Spain and Portugal. Of course, they're going to hate the Huguenots and the Protestants. That's the same people. And he considered them heretics because, again, they're not Catholics. They're not really Christians. It's just outwardly. Remember? They were still practicing their beliefs, their Muslim and Jewish beliefs. He ordered his troops to kill any they found in the colonies. So this is the war that I'm talking about. You know, Catholics are going after the Protestants and Huguenots and all these people because they're Moors and Sephardic Jews. Therefore, in 1565, troops under Pedro Menendez de Aviles notoriously massacred hundreds of Frenchmen around Fort Caroline in what is now, and this is wrong, it's not in Jacksonville. They got this wrong in Wikipedia. We already read where it was located. After capturing the fort and slaying nearly all his prisoners, Menendez hung their bodies on the trees with the inscription, not as a Frenchman, but as Lutherans. So he's saying, I didn't kill them because they were French, but because they're, because they're cryptos. They're not really Christians or so-called Lutherans. The massacre aroused indignation in France among the Protestants and Catholics alike. The French king sent complaints to the Spanish court, but Menendez and his associates, instead of being punished for the deed, received rewards and honors. I just want to read the overall story to you guys. Now it says here, revenge. We just read about Dominique De Gourgues, right? Expedition to French Florida. Embittered by the cruelty and indignity that he had suffered from the Spaniards, the Catholics, De Gourgues determined to avenge the murder of his Protestant compatriots. He was a Protestant. He is a Huguenot. He is a Protestant. He's a crypto Jew, crypto Muslim. Though he was himself a Catholic, he had converted though. He had to survive. He sold everything he had and borrowed money from his brother Antoine to recruit a crew and chartered 3 ships. He sailed to Cuba with 200 men, never telling them the goal of their trip. Listen to where they went, listen to what he was doing. Once in Cuba, he made his intentions clear and his crew approved his choice of revenge. Gourgues then moved to attack Spanish-held Fort Caroline. So the Catholics had murdered the original people that were in Fort Caroline, which was the Huguenots, right? So now they had control of the fort, and the Gourgues came. He moved and attacked this fort, which they had renamed as Fort San Mateo, enlisting the aid of Fort Caroline's old allies, the Saturigua. Who's the Saturigua? Were a Timucua chieftain, and then the Takatakuru was a Timucua chieftain as well. So these Indians helped Gourgues, right, the Huguenot, the Protestant, all people of color against other people of color, Catholics. Again, with the help of clans of the Timucua Indians, the fort soon surrendered to the Gourgues forces. The French and Indians killed the Spanish prisoners in retribution for Fort Caroline and other massacres of Protestants. They hated the Catholics because of what they had done to their people, this war they were having. They're being persecuted by the Catholics ever since they left Iberia. They hanged the prisoners with the inscription, not as Spaniards, but as murderers. Whoa. All right, Hane, that's the source. Go check that out. So you see they got them back. We didn't kill them because they were from Spain, because that's our ancestry too. We killed them because they were murderers. They came and killed the Huguenots there first. Remember? Again, I know a lot of people are new to this. They might have never known that the Huguenots were Moors. Just going over some information here that we've gone over many, many times. This is the book History of the Conquest of Spain by the Arab Moors by Henry Copey, written in 1892. We're on page 445. And right there, they're talking about Christopher Columbus and how he believed only Moorish civilization was good, and that his vessel was fitted out in that little port of Palos, which had lately been a Moorish port. His sailors were many of them men with Moorish blood in their veins. It has been asserted that when the Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in the south of France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became Huguenots. Who became Huguenots? Moors. Moors when they were driven out. Moors, right? Moors when they were driven out of Spain and Portugal. They ended up in southern France, became known as Huguenots, right? They're being persecuted by the Catholics. So this is a beef they had. Huguenots are Moors and Sephardic Jews as well. So when they're telling us Dominique De Gourgues took revenge on the Catholics for his Huguenot or Protestant compatriots, that's his people, Moors. I want to read from this book now. It's called The Lily and the Totem, or The Huguenots in Florida, the Moors in Florida, 1562 to 1570, a series of sketches, pictures, and historical of the colonies of Colonial in North America, University of California, This is written from 1850. This was written in 1850. Just real quick, in chapter 1, they're talking about the first voyage of revolt. This was like one of the first Huguenots that came into Florida. It says here the Huguenots, or the Moors, right? In plain terms, in very plain terms, were the Protestants of France. Who's the Protestants? They were a sect which rose very soon after the preaching of the Reformation had passed from Germany into the neighboring countries. In France, they first excited the apprehensions and provoked the hostility of the Roman Catholic priesthood. You see, because these were Moors and Sephardic Jews, they were at war with them. During the reign of Francis I, this prince, unstable as water, and governed rather by his humors and caprices than by any fixed principles of conduct, wanton, perhaps equally in the head and heart, showed himself in the outset of his career rather friendly to the reformers. But they were soon destined to suffer, with more decided favorites from the caprices of his despotism. The Huguenots were not originally known by this name. It does not appear to have been one of their own chosen. That's not what their name was. It was the name which distinguished them in the days of their persecution. Remember, it meant a confederation, a coming together of comrades. All right, look up the etymology of Huguenot. You'll see it. Confederacy. Again, it distinguished them because of their persecution. Their persecution. Who's being persecuted? The Moors and Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal by the Catholics, the Holy Roman Emperor. Right? Who? Another so-called black man, Charles V. So we go to chapter 25. Yeah, 25. Dominique De Gourgues. Early history of Gourgues. The tidings of the fearful massacre of the Huguenots in Florida, as well in Spanish as in French accounts, at length reached France. Deep was the feeling of horror and indignation which they everywhere excited among the people. Catholics, not less than Protestants, felt how terrible was the cruelty thus inflicted upon humanity, how insolent the scorn thus put upon the flag of the country. Wild and bitter was the cry of anguish sent up by the thousands bereaved widows and orphans of the murdered men. But this cry, this feeling, this sense of suffering and shame awakened no sympathies in the court of France. The King Charles IX heard the supplication of the wives and children of the sufferers without according any answer to the prayer. The blood of nearly 900 victims, 900 people in Fort Caroline. Do you guys hear that? That's how many people, the Catholics, right? Charles V's people went in there and murdered nearly 900 people. Cried equally to earth and heaven for vengeance, and cried in vain to the earthly sovereign. He had no ear for the sorrows and the wrongs of heresy, and the plight of humanity was stifled in the supposed interests of religion. Charles was most regally indifferent to a crime which relieved him of so many troublesome subjects, and was at that very time meditating the most summary processes for still farther diminishing their numbers. He was yet to provide an appropriate finish to such a history of massacre and the bloody tragedy of St. Bartholomew. All right, check out my Huguenots video. We went over the whole history of what happened to the Huguenots and Protestants. You know, how they were being massacred. But remember, I just want to remind you that eventually Oliver Cromwell, right, he was a Protestant, so they did the same thing to the Catholics when they were in power. You know, and that's when they got rid of the Jacobites. The Jacobites were Catholic, and these were black folks too. So don't think we're talking about white and black, because we're talking about Catholics and Protestants. But if the court of France demanded no redress for the massacre of its people, and that of Spain offered none, either address or apology, there was yet a deep and intense passion dwelling in the heart of the one nation, and yearning for revenge upon that of the other. There was still a chivalrous feeling in France, which showed itself superior to the exactions of sect or party, and which brought it with terrible intensity over the bloody fortunes of the French in Florida. This moody meditation at length found its fitting exponent. The sentiment that stirs earnestly in the popular heart will always, sooner or later, obtain a fitting voice, and where it burns justifiably for vengeance, it will not long be wanting in a weapon. The avenger arose in due season to satisfy the demands of justice. All right, so this is what they're talking about. So this is the background of Dominique De Gourgues, right? Before he did his expedition, so-called expedition, he was on a mission. He was on a military campaign to get rid of the Catholics. And remember, and he allied with Timucua Indians. All right, so there is part of history too, an important thing to understand. All right, a little more ahead in the book, just here in part 8, it says the conquest of La Caroline. The Chevalier de Gourgues now proposed temporarily to rest from his labors and give himself a reasonable time before attempting the superior fortress of La Caroline. All right, it says here the Indians meanwhile had been ordered to environ the fortress and so to cover the whole face of the country as to make it impossible that the garrison should obtain help, convey intelligence of their situation to their friends in St. Augustine, or escape from the beleaguered station. So they had the Timucua Indians that are again helping and making sure nobody escapes the fort, none of those Catholics or the people working for them. All right, so after they capture the fortress and they go in, he describes how they did it, where they stationed, how they got in. It's a very good book if you want to read it. Uh, I'm just jumping to certain sections. It says the captured fortress was one with a singular facility and with so little loss to the assailants as to confirm them in the conviction that the service was acceptable to God. But his vengeance was not complete. The final act of expiation was yet to take place, and bringing all his prisoners together, he had them conducted to the fatal tree upon which the Spaniards had done to death their Huguenot captives. He's going to take revenge. This was at a short distance from the fortress. Mournful was the spectacle that met the eyes of the Frenchmen or the Huguenots or the Moors, right, as they reached the spot. There still hung the withered and wasted skeletons of their brethren. They still had the skeletons there of the Huguenots or the Moors. The Catholics did, right? So-called Catholics. Naked, bare of flesh, bleached and rattling against the branches of the thrice accursed tree. The tempest had beaten wildly against their wasted forms. The obscene birds had preyed upon their carcasses, some had fallen, and lay in undistinguished heaps upon the earth. But the entire skeletons of many unbroken still waved in the unconscious breezes of heaven. For 2 weary years had they been thus tossed and shaken in the tempest. For 2 years had they thus waved, ghastly, white, and terrible, in mockery of the blessed sunshine. And now, in the genial breezes of April, they still shook aloft in horrible contrast with the green leaves and the purple blossoms of spring around them. But they were now decreed to take their shame from the suffering eyes of day. A solemn service was set over the wretched remains, which were taken down with cautious hands, as considerately as they were still accessible to hurt, and buried in one common grave. The red man looked on wondering and in grave silence, and Holata Kara, leaning upon his spear, might almost be thought to weep at the cruel spectacle. But his aspect changed when the Spanish captives were brought forth. They were ranged, manacled in pairs, beneath the same tree of sacrifice. Briefly and in stern accents did Gourgues recite the crime of which they had been guilty, and which they were now to expiate by a sufferance of the same fate which they had decreed to their victims. Prayers and pleadings were alike in vain. The priest who had performed the solemn rites for the dead now performed the last duties for the living judged. He heard their confessions. One of the wretched victims confessed that the judgment under which he was about to suffer was a just one, that he himself with his own hands had hung no less than 5 of the wretched Huguenots. He was proud of it, you see that? He killed 5 Moors. With such a confession ringing in their ears, it was not possible for the French to be merciful. At a given signal, the victims were run up to the deadly branches, which they themselves had accursed by such employment, and even while their suspended forms riddled and quivered with the last fruitless efforts of expiring consciousness, the chieftain Holatakara looked upon them with a cold, hard eye, stern and tearless, as if he felt the dreadful propriety of this wild and unrelenting justice. The deed done, the expiation made, Gourgues then procured a huge plank of pine, upon which he caused to be branded with a searing iron in rude but large intelligible characters these words, corresponding to that inscription put by the Spaniards over the Huguenots, and as fitting commentary upon it. These are not hung as Spaniards, nor as mariners, or as Moors, right? But as traitors, robbers, and murderers. Traitors, a lot of them were Moors who had converted to Catholics. Traitors, robbers, and murderers. They had killed the Huguenots, his people. Okay? So I just wanted to read, how deep this was, because an Access Genealogy website, they don't really tell us much. We're just talking about a more on more war here. Shout out to Drop Nation, Con Drop, what we call today so-called black on black crime. All right, so